casino floor was glowing under bright lights. Rows of slot machines flashed nonstop, their screens blinking with colorful symbols. Coins clinked, cards shuffled across green tables, and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations filled the air. Dealers called out bets while waiters moved between the tables, carrying trays of drinks. It was the kind of place where excitement never seemed to stop. In one quiet corner of the casino, however, the atmosphere felt different. A blackjack table stood under a softer light, and at that table sat a man who looked completely calm. Steven Seagal. Unlike the other players around him, he wasn't celebrating or reacting loudly to the cards. He simply watched the game carefully, his expression steady and controlled. His stack of chips had slowly grown over the past hour, but he didn't show even a hint of excitement. The dealer dealt another round. Steven placed his bet quietly. Win or lose, his reaction stayed exactly the same. But across the casino floor, 3 loud men leaning against a nearby bar had been watching him for a while. One of them took a sip of his drink and narrowed his eyes. "That guy's been winning all night," he muttered. Another man turned to look. "Yeah, and he hasn't said a word the whole time." The tallest of the 3 men cracked his knuckles and smiled slightly. "Well, maybe someone should remind him whose casino this really is." The other 2 laughed. They pushed away from the bar and started walking toward the blackjack table. Their footsteps were slow but confident, the kind of walk people use when they want everyone to notice them. Several players nearby glanced in their direction. Even the dealer at Steven's table noticed them approaching. Within seconds, the energy around the table shifted. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as a few players leaned back, sensing trouble before a single word had even been spoken. The 3 men stopped right beside the table. One of them leaned forward, staring at Steven's stack of chips. Another pulled a chair closer with a loud scrape, and the tallest man spoke first. "You've been pretty lucky tonight," he said slowly. Steven looked up calmly. For a moment, neither side moved. Then the man smiled again, but there was no friendliness in it. "You know," he continued, his voice lower now, "some people around here don't like outsiders winning too much." The dealer froze. Nearby conversations began to fade as more people quietly turned their heads toward the table. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at the man and replied in a calm, steady tone, "I'm just playing the game." But the 3 men exchanged looks and chuckled softly, because they hadn't come there to play cards. And within moments, security on the casino floor started walking toward the table. What no one inside that casino realized yet was that before the night was over, those same security guards would end up standing on Steven's side instead. Have you ever seen someone try to intimidate the wrong person? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The blackjack table slowly returned to motion, but the atmosphere around it had changed. The dealer carefully shuffled the cards again, though his hands moved a little slower than before. He had seen situations like this many times in casinos. When loud men started surrounding a table, it rarely ended quietly. The 3 men remained standing near Steven now. They didn't sit down. They didn't place any bets. They simply watched him. Steven remained exactly the same as before, calm, quiet, focused. He adjusted the stack of chips in front of him and waited for the next hand without showing any sign of discomfort. But the tallest man leaned forward again, resting one hand on the edge of the table. "You've had a pretty good night," he said slowly, staring at the chips. Steven glanced at the dealer and then back at the man. "I've had a fair game," he replied. The second man chuckled softly. "Fair," he repeated. "You call that fair?" A couple sitting at the next table quietly picked up their chips and walked away. They didn't want to be anywhere near a scene. Casinos were designed to look glamorous and exciting, but everyone who spent enough time in them knew one truth. Trouble could appear at any moment, and when it did, it usually moved fast. Across the room, 2 security guards noticed the unusual tension forming near the blackjack area. They stood near the entrance hallway, watching the interaction carefully. One of them spoke quietly into his radio. "Table 14 looks like it might need attention." The other guard nodded. They didn't rush. Experienced security knew that rushing often made situations worse. Instead, they started walking slowly toward the table, observing every movement. Back at the table, the tallest man finally pulled a chair and sat down heavily beside Steven. The sound of the chair scraping across the floor made the dealer pause again. "You know," the man said, lowering his voice slightly, "people who win too much sometimes attract the wrong kind of attention." Steven didn't look surprised. He simply folded his hands on the table for a moment. "I'm not here for attention," he said calmly. The third man leaned closer now, placing both hands on the back of Steven's chair. "You're here taking money," he said. Steven turned his head slightly. "The casino invited players. he replied quietly. The men exchanged amused looks. Around them, the table had almost completely cleared. Only the dealer remained seated across from Steven, his eyes moving nervously between the players and the approaching security guards. At the edge of the casino floor, the two guards were now only a few tables away. But one of them had slowed his steps. He studied Steven more carefully now. There was something unusual about the way the man sat. His posture was relaxed but balanced. His eyes moved calmly around the room, noticing small details without turning his head much. That wasn't the behavior of someone feeling threatened. It looked more like someone who was completely aware of everything happening around him. The guard frowned slightly. Something about this man seemed familiar. But before he could think about it further, the tallest man at the table tapped Steven's chips with 2 fingers and spoke again. "Maybe it's time you stopped playing," he said. Steven looked at him calmly. "And if I don't?" The man leaned closer, his smile fading. "Then we'll help you leave." At that exact moment, the 2 security guards finally stepped up to the table, and what they saw next would change the entire situation inside the casino. The 2 security guards stepped closer to the blackjack table, their presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone nearby. One of them spoke first, his voice firm but controlled. "Is there a problem here?" For a brief moment, no one answered. The dealer looked relieved to see them, but he stayed silent. Casinos had strict rules about dealers getting involved in conflicts. The tallest of the 3 men finally turned toward the guards and shrugged casually. "No problem," he said. "We're just having a conversation." But his tone didn't match his words. The tension around the table was obvious. Steven remained seated, his hands resting calmly near his stack of chips. The first guard looked at him. "Sir, is everything all right here?" Steven nodded slightly. "I'm just playing the game." The second guard glanced at the 3 men surrounding the table. Their posture made it clear this was more than a friendly discussion. One of the men leaned forward again, tapping Steven's stack of chips with his finger. "Actually," he said loudly, "this guy's about to leave." The guard frowned. "Why would he be leaving?" The tall man smirked. "'Cause he's done playing." Steven slowly looked up at him. "I didn't say that," he replied calmly. The words were simple, but the way he said them made the room feel quieter. The man's smile faded slightly. "You don't get it," he said, leaning closer. "People like you come in here thinking you're smart." Steven didn't respond. He simply looked at the cards still lying on the table. The dealer remained frozen, waiting for instructions. Another man in the group spoke up now, his tone mocking. "Maybe he thinks he's in one of those action movies." The 3 men laughed loudly. But Steven didn't react. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply sat there, calm and still. The first security guard studied him carefully now. There was something unusual about this situation. Most people in casinos became nervous the moment security arrived during an argument. But Steven showed no signs of stress at all. His breathing remained steady. His posture remained balanced. His eyes moved calmly between the men standing around him. The guard leaned slightly toward his partner and spoke quietly. "Something about this guy feels different." His partner nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same thing." Back at the table, the tallest man suddenly slammed his palm lightly against the felt surface. "Listen," he said, his voice louder now. "You're finished here." Several people from nearby tables turned their heads. The tension was becoming impossible to ignore. Steven finally moved his hands. But instead of pushing back his chair or standing up, he simply folded them calmly on the table. "If the casino wants me to leave," he said quietly, "the manager can ask me." The words were calm, but they carried confidence. The tall man narrowed his eyes. "You think you're in charge here?" Steven shook his head slightly. "No." Then he added one simple sentence. "But you're not." The third man stepped closer, gripping the back of Steven's chair. "That's enough," he said. "Stand up." For a moment, the entire table fell silent. Even the slot machines nearby seemed quieter. Steven slowly looked up at the man behind him, and for the first time since the confrontation started, he spoke in a slightly firmer tone. "You should move your hand." The warning wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it was clear. The man hesitated for a split second. Across the table, the 2 security guards exchanged another look. The first guard had seen something during that moment that made his instincts react, the way Steven had spoken. The calm control in his voice, and the absolute confidence in his posture. That wasn't how ordinary players behaved when surrounded by 3 aggressive men. That was how trained professionals behaved. The guard felt a strange feeling of recognition building in his mind. But before he could place it, one of the 3 men spoke again. "Security," he said loudly, pointing at Steven. "This guy is cheating." The accusation immediately spread whispers across the nearby tables. Cheating in a casino was a serious claim. The first guard turned back toward Steven. "Sir," he said carefully, "we may need you to step away from the table." Steven slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, but the moment he did, one of the guards looked directly at his face under the bright casino lights, and suddenly something clicked in his memory. He had definitely seen this man before. The question was, where? For a moment, the casino floor felt strangely quiet. Steven stood beside the blackjack table, calm as ever, while the three men remained close, watching him carefully. The accusation of cheating still hung in the air, and several nearby players had paused their games just to see what would happen next. Casinos rarely liked attention. Problems were usually handled quickly and quietly, but this situation had already drawn more eyes than anyone expected. The first security guard stepped slightly closer to Steven, keeping his tone professional. "Sir," he said, "we've had a complaint about the game. We just need to clear things up." Steven nodded calmly. "That's fine." His reaction surprised the guard. Most people accused of cheating either became angry or defensive. Steven didn't either. He simply stood there, relaxed, his hands loosely at his sides. The second guard watched him carefully now. Something about the man's posture felt unusual. Even while standing in the middle of a confrontation, Steven's balance looked perfect. His shoulders were relaxed, his breathing slow and steady, and his eyes continued scanning the room in quiet observation. That kind of awareness wasn't normal for someone caught in a stressful situation. The guard leaned slightly toward his partner. "You notice the way he moves," he whispered. The first guard nodded slowly. "Yeah," he replied under his breath. "I've seen that before." Meanwhile, the tallest of the three men crossed his arms, clearly enjoying the attention. "Go ahead," he said loudly to the guards. "Check the cameras. This guy's been running the table all night." Another man added with a mocking grin, "Maybe he's counting cards." A few people nearby murmured quietly. Card counting wasn't illegal, but casinos didn't like it. Still, the accusation didn't seem to affect Steven at all. He simply looked at the security guards and said calmly, "You're welcome to review anything you want." The confidence in his voice made the second guard study him even more closely. He stepped slightly to the side, looking at Steven from another angle. That was when something suddenly caught his attention. The man's face looked extremely familiar. Not the kind of familiarity you get from seeing someone once or twice. The kind that felt like you had watched them somewhere many times before. The guard narrowed his eyes slightly, trying to remember where he had seen him. Across the table, the dealer cleared his throat nervously. "Should I continue the game?" he asked quietly. The first guard shook his head. Not yet. The casino floor manager had already been notified by radio, and he was on his way. Until then, security needed to keep things under control. The tallest man leaned toward Steven again. "You see," he said with a smirk. "Told you it was time to leave." Steven turned his head slightly and looked directly at him. "If the casino asks me to leave," he replied calmly, "I will." The man laughed loudly. "Oh, they will." But at that moment, the second security guard suddenly stepped forward. His expression had changed. He looked from Steven to the three men and then back again. Something had finally clicked in his mind. He leaned closer to his partner and spoke quietly. "I think I know who this guy is." The first guard frowned. "Who?" The second guard didn't answer immediately. He studied Steven again carefully. The calm presence, the sharp awareness, the unmistakable confidence. It all suddenly made sense. Before he could speak again, however, footsteps approached quickly from behind them. The casino floor manager had finally arrived. He stepped between the guards and the table, looking at everyone involved. "What's going on here?" he asked. The tall man immediately pointed at Steven. "This guy's cheating," he said quickly. "We want him out." The manager turned toward Steven. For a moment, he simply looked at him under the bright lights of the casino floor. Then something unexpected happened. The manager's eyes widened slightly. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition. He stepped closer. "Wait a second," he said slowly. The three men looked confident, expecting the manager to throw Steven out immediately. But instead, the manager stared at him for another moment. Then he asked carefully, "Sir, are you Steven Seagal?" The entire blackjack area fell silent. The security guards looked at each other, and the three men suddenly stopped smiling. Because in that exact moment, the situation inside the casino had just completely changed. For a brief moment, the blackjack table felt completely frozen. The casino lights still flashed across the floor. Slot machines continued ringing in the distance. Dealers at other tables kept calling out bets. But around this one table, no one spoke. The floor manager's question hung in the air. "Sir, are you Steven Seagal?" The three men who had been laughing only seconds earlier suddenly looked uncertain. They exchanged quick glances with each other. Steven didn't react dramatically. He simply looked at the manager and gave a small, calm nod. Yes. The word was quiet, but the reaction around the table was immediate. The two security guards straightened slightly, suddenly realizing why the man had seemed so familiar. The guard who had been studying Steven earlier let out a quiet breath. I knew I'd seen him somewhere. He muttered under his breath. The manager immediately changed his posture. Just moments ago he had arrived expecting to remove a troublesome guest. Now his expression carried respect. Sir, he said politely, I apologize for the confusion. The tall man who had started the confrontation blinked in surprise. Wait, what? He looked from the manager to Steven. You're serious. The second man frowned. You mean the actor? But the security guard stepped forward before the conversation could go any further. His tone had completely changed. Gentlemen, he said firmly, turning to the three men, you need to step away from the table. The tall man laughed nervously. Hold on, he said quickly. We were just talking. But the guard didn't move. I said step away. The third man tried to recover the situation. He's cheating, he insisted. We saw it. The manager shook his head calmly. Sir, the casino cameras monitor every table from multiple angles. He gestured toward the ceiling. If there were any signs of cheating, we would already know. The tall man's confidence began fading. But he's been winning all night, he argued. The dealer finally spoke up for the first time since the confrontation began. He's been playing by the rules. The dealer said carefully. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. No unusual bets. No suspicious behavior. The room grew even quieter. The manager nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the three men. In fact, he said calmly, the only disturbance reported at this table came from you. Several nearby players who had been watching the scene quietly nodded. They had seen everything from the beginning. The security guard stepped slightly closer now. Gentlemen, he repeated, this is your final warning. The tall man looked around the table again. For the first time since approaching Steven, he looked uncomfortable. The atmosphere had completely shifted. Only minutes earlier, they had expected security to throw Steven out. Now security was standing firmly beside him. The second man spoke quietly to the tall one. Maybe we should just go. But pride made the tall man hesitate. He pointed once more at Steven. You're telling me this guy can just sit here and take money from everyone? Steven finally spoke again. His voice remained calm. I didn't take anything. He gestured lightly toward the table. I played the game. The words weren't aggressive, but they carried a quiet confidence that made the tall man stop talking. The manager nodded respectfully. That's exactly right. Then he turned back to the three men. However, he added calmly, causing trouble for other guests is against casino policy. The security guards took another step closer. The meaning was clear. The tall man looked around the casino floor one last time. More people were watching now. Dealers, players, staff members, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, the tall man exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered. He stepped back from the table. The other two men followed. But before leaving, the tall man glanced once more at Steven. You got lucky tonight, he said quietly. Steven didn't respond. He simply picked up his stack of chips and placed them neatly in front of him again. The manager turned back to Steven with a respectful nod. My apologies again, sir, he said. You're welcome to continue playing. The dealer straightened in his chair and prepared the cards once more. Around the table, the tension slowly began to fade. But the security guards remained standing nearby for a moment longer. And as the three men were escorted away across the casino floor, one of the guards leaned slightly toward the other and said quietly, Funny how things change when people realize who they're dealing with. And at that moment, the entire casino finally understood something. The situation that had almost turned into a serious confrontation had just completely reversed. Because the man they had tried to push out of the casino was someone security now had every reason to protect. The three men were now several steps away from the blackjack table, slowly being guided across the casino floor by security. Their confident expressions from earlier had completely disappeared. Around the table, the atmosphere was still tense, but the situation had clearly shifted. Players who had stepped away earlier were beginning to move closer again, curious to see what would happen next. The casino manager remained beside Steven, maintaining a respectful distance. Again, sir, I apologize for the interruption, he said calmly. Steven gave a small nod. It's not a problem, he replied. His voice carried no anger, no frustration. If anything, he sounded as relaxed as he had when the night first began. The dealer exhaled quietly and began organizing the cards again, waiting for confirmation that the game could continue. But the security guards were still watching Steven carefully. Now that they knew who he was, Everything about the situation made more sense. The calm posture, the quiet confidence, the way he had observed every movement around the room. The first guard leaned slightly toward the manager. "I should have recognized him earlier," he admitted quietly. The manager nodded. "He's been here before," he said. "Always keeps things low-key." Nearby players whispered among themselves as the realization spread. "Is that really Steven Seagal?" one man asked. Another nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's him." Across the casino floor, the three men who had caused the trouble were still arguing quietly with security as they were escorted toward the exit. The tallest one looked back toward the table several times, clearly frustrated. But the guards remained firm. "You've been asked to leave," one of them said. "Let's keep moving." Back at the table, the dealer looked toward Steven. "Would you like to continue the game, sir?" he asked. Steven glanced briefly at the cards and the stack of chips in front of him. "Sure," he replied calmly. The dealer nodded and began shuffling again. But the second security guard still seemed curious. He stepped a little closer and spoke respectfully. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, were you in law enforcement before acting?" Steven gave a faint smile. "Something like that," he said. The guard nodded, remembering the way Steven had reacted earlier. "You handled that situation pretty calmly," he said. Steven shrugged slightly. "Getting angry rarely improves things." The simple sentence made the guard think for a moment. Across the table, the manager folded his arms thoughtfully. "You'd be surprised how many people lose control in situations like that," he said. Steven looked around the casino floor briefly. Bright lights reflected off the polished surfaces. Players had returned to their games, and the usual rhythm of the casino had resumed. "That's why it's better not to take things personally," Steven said quietly. The manager nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, near the entrance of the casino, the three men were finally being escorted out through the main doors. One of them turned back one last time, clearly annoyed, but the doors closed behind them before they could say anything else. Back at the blackjack table, the dealer placed the cards down carefully. "Your move," he said. Steven looked at his hand briefly and placed a small stack of chips forward. Around the table, several players who had returned to watch the game seemed noticeably calmer now. The earlier tension had disappeared, and yet the story of what had just happened was already spreading quietly across the casino floor. Dealers whispered to each other. Players leaned across tables sharing the story. Staff members glanced toward the blackjack corner with curiosity. It didn't take long for everyone nearby to understand what had happened. Three men had tried to intimidate someone they thought was just another quiet player. Instead, they had found themselves escorted out by the very security they expected to support them. The first security guard looked around the room again before stepping away from the table. "Looks like everything's under control now," he said to his partner. The second guard nodded, but before leaving he looked back toward Steven one last time. The calmness that had impressed him earlier was still there. Even after the confrontation, even after the attention, Steven simply focused on the cards as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The guard shook his head slightly and smiled. "Some people just carry that kind of presence," he said quietly. His partner agreed. "Yeah," he replied. "And those are usually the people you don't want to underestimate." The dealer dealt the next card. Steven glanced at it briefly. Then he calmly pushed another bet forward. For him, the night at the casino had simply returned to normal. But for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation, it had become a moment they wouldn't forget anytime soon. The tension that had filled the blackjack area slowly faded, replaced once again by the familiar sounds of the casino. Slot machines rang out with their flashing lights. Cards slid smoothly across green felt tables. Dealers called out bets while players leaned forward in anticipation. To most people walking through the casino, everything looked normal again. But those who had witnessed the confrontation at the blackjack table knew that something unusual had just happened. Steven remained seated, his focus still on the game. The dealer placed another card on the table. Steven glanced at it briefly and adjusted the stack of chips in front of him. His movements were calm and precise, exactly the same as they had been before the confrontation began. Across the table, a middle-aged man who had returned to watch the game leaned toward the dealer and whispered quietly, "Was that really Steven Seagal?" The dealer nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied. The man shook his head slowly. "I can't believe those guys didn't recognize him." Nearby, another player chuckled softly. They probably thought he was just another quiet guy winning at cards. The dealer smiled faintly but didn't say anything else. He had worked in casinos long enough to know that appearances often fooled people. And tonight had been a perfect example of that. At the edge of the casino floor, The two security guards who had handled the situation stood near the entrance hallway again. They watched the crowd moving across the floor as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the first guard still seemed thoughtful. He leaned slightly toward his partner. "You know," he said quietly, "that could have turned into a big mess." The second guard nodded. "Yeah," he replied. "But he never lost control." The first guard looked back toward the blackjack table where Steven was still playing. "That's what impressed me the most," he said. "Most people would have reacted the moment those guys started pushing." His partner folded his arms. "But he didn't." "Nope," the first guard said. "He just stayed calm the whole time." They watched for a few seconds as the dealer dealt another round of cards. Steven placed another bet with the same steady confidence. There was no sign that the earlier confrontation had affected him at all. Meanwhile, outside the casino entrance, the three men who had caused the trouble were still arguing quietly among themselves in the parking area. The tall one paced back and forth, clearly frustrated. "I can't believe security took his side," he muttered. One of the others shook his head. "You picked the wrong guy," he said. The tall man stopped pacing. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" The third man shrugged. "That's the point," he replied. Inside the casino, the story continued spreading quietly. Staff members whispered about the situation. Players who had seen the confrontation retold the moment security changed sides. And every version of the story ended the same way. Three men tried to intimidate someone they assumed was weak. Instead, they discovered they had completely misjudged the situation. Back at the blackjack table, the dealer placed the final card of the round. Steven looked at his hand and gave a small nod. "Stand," he said calmly. The dealer revealed the final card and announced the result. 21. A few players around the table chuckled softly. "Looks like your luck is still going," one of them said. Steven gave a faint smile but didn't celebrate. He simply collected his chips and placed them neatly back into a small stack. For him, the night had never been about proving anything. It had simply been another quiet evening at the casino. The manager approached the table once more, maintaining the respectful tone he had used earlier. "Everything going well, sir?" he asked. Steven nodded. "Everything's fine." The manager smiled politely. "Good to hear." He glanced briefly around the table and then returned to monitoring the casino floor. The dealer prepared the next round of cards. But before dealing, he looked at Steven and spoke quietly. "You handled that situation better than most people would have." Steven shrugged slightly. "Sometimes the best response," he said calmly, "is no reaction at all." The dealer thought about that for a moment before nodding. True. Across the casino floor, the two security guards were preparing to rotate shifts. The first guard looked one last time toward the blackjack table. "You think those guys learned anything tonight?" he asked. His partner chuckled softly. "Probably." Then he added quietly, "But people usually learn the hard way." They both turned and walked toward the security office. Behind them, the casino continued buzzing with energy. Players laughed, machines chimed, cards shuffled across tables. And in the quiet corner where the blackjack game continued, Steven placed another bet with the same calm confidence as before. For most people in the room, he looked like just another player enjoying the game. But the ones who had seen what happened earlier knew something different. They had watched three aggressive men try to push someone out of the casino. And they had watched the entire situation reverse the moment security realized who they were dealing with. Because sometimes the person who appears the quietest in the room is also the one you should never underestimate. If you respect calm strength and self-control, type RASPCT in the comments. And tell me which country you're watching from.